Today we're going to be making bread. Yes, the bread is sugar-free. You know, it does have the carbs and all, so you got to kind of watch that. But you can use whole wheat. Makes it a little bit easier on your system. But today we're going to just do a regular white bread. We start off with 3 cups of warm water. To that, add 1½ tablespoon of yeast. A 1/4 cup of Splenda. And we're going to mix that in. Next, we're going to add our bread flour. Being here in Montana, I like the Wheat Montana flour. This is fantastic. The flavor's great. The whole golden whole wheat, oh, just incredible. Going to start it out with 2 cups and start that mixing in. You don't want your mixer too high, you'll be throwing flour everywhere, and I get enough flour everywhere as it is. This is not going to incorporate fully with just the dough hook. So we'll kill it. Scrape down the sides, get it into the middle more. Get that flour wet. Now when this is mixed in good, you're going to add 1.5 tablespoons of salt. And 1/2 cup of vegetable oil. And mix some more. Whenever you feel the side walls need to be scraped, get in there and scrape them. At this point, your mix is pretty wet, so it's really not going to make much of a difference. So we get the oil and the salt incorporated in a little bit better. And we're going to slowly start adding more flour, 1 cup at a time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Now when we get enough flour in, this is going to start to pull away from the walls and you won't have to scrape as much. Now the dough is getting close to where we want it. So I'm going to go to putting in just like a half a cup of flour at a time until I get the right consistency. Now remember, this is bread flour. You can do it with an all-purpose flour, but you're not going to quite get the consistency of the bread and the rise and everything that you will with a bread flour. You know, it does have more gluten. And I know everybody's got this big thing about gluten right now. But all the people I've ever met in my life, I've only met one person that has celiac disease, where gluten was a physical issue. So don't worry about it. Now see how this is pulling away from the sides and all and forming a bundle around the dough hook? As soon as all the flour on the bottom is incorporated in, it should be good to go. If you don't have a stand mixer with a dough hook, you can do this by hand. But I may have mentioned before, I'm lazy, so I use the mixer. When this pulls away from the sides and makes a nice round ball on your dough hook, you've got the right amount of flour in the texture, and when you push your fingers into it, you don't get any dough coming off on your fingers. It should be warm, soft, just yield a little bit, kind of like your lover's tush. And then all you have to do is knead it with the dough hook for a minute or two. Now that this is all nicely kneaded and everything, we need to get this ball out. And we're just going to knead this a little bit by hand and round it out. I like to keep going around and with my fingers push the outside in so it goes into the bottom as we go around. Now we take a large bowl, spray the inside with a little oil, and that ball's going to go right inside. Kind of toss it around a little bit to get the whole outside covered in oil. Once your dough is doubled in size, usually about an hour, we go on to the next step. First, prep out. You're going to take your bread pans and spray them with cooking oil. This recipe does 2 loaves, so we need 2 pans, of course. Your oven should be already on 350. We're going to take our dough and we're going to knock it down. Get it out of our bowl onto a surface, and we're going to work this back into a ball. Knock that air out, We're going to let it rise again once it's in the bread pans. Now you just take your dough, cut it in half. Try and get it as even as possible, but if it's not, just show people one loaf at a time. They'll think you're always perfect. Now we're going to shape this to fit the pan a little better. Roll it out, kind of an oblong feel to it. Try and get it a little more even. Heck, it's like Play-Doh. Once you got it about the size of the pan, just bring your pan over, drop it in. Now you're going to take your damp cloth, cover these pans, and again let it double in size. Your bread in your pans has risen. Take your cloth off, there's a nice height to it. Now one of the things I like to do to help with your crust and the coloration is I'll take butter and lightly brush butter across the tops. Now your oven's already preheated to 350. Now because I don't have a professional oven with a nice steamer in it for my bread, what I do is I take a pan of water and put it on the rack right under my bread and let that heat up and kind of get a little moisture into the oven. That way you won't get a hard crust on your bread. It'll keep it nice and tender. Ooh, lovely. So we're going to put both loaves in for about 30 minutes. At the end of your 30 minutes, look at the color. Oops, got an air bubble, we'll get rid of that. A couple of them there. And if it's not quite brown enough for you, leave it in for another minute or two. It's not going to affect the inside of the bread, and this bread is just wonderful. Now when your 30 minutes are up, I like to put my bread on a separate pan. That makes this little next step a little bit easier. What my grandmother and mother always did when they took their bread out of the oven was to coat it with butter. This keeps your bread from drying. It keeps a nice, light, tender crust on it. And you get that great butter flavor. You know, if you're vegan, you can do this with margarine, it works just as well. The extra pan just makes it easier to clean up. Now take that bread and flip it over. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? And you made it yourself. Sure, it takes a couple of hours, but it's well worth it. When I was growing up, my family had an apiary. They were beekeepers. And let me tell you, you take your honey, little butter in it, put it in the microwave, heat it up, stir it all in, and then you just take chunks of this bread and rip it off and dip it in that butter and honey and eat it. Oh, it's just heaven. So if you enjoyed this, like and subscribe. And it's sugar free. Not carb free though.